My name is Vivian Castellano. I am 30 years old. 6 days ago, I stood in my own kitchen holding a stack of moving boxes my mother-in-law had left folded on my counter, a yellow sticky note pressed to the top one that said, in her handwriting, "Guest room first, then ours." Not a question, an instruction, written in my house, on my counter. I did not raise my voice. I did not even set the boxes down hard. I picked up my phone, opened a folder labeled with a date from 14 months earlier, and sent one email to one person. 12 minutes later, my father-in-law's phone rang while he was standing in what he believed was about to become his living room, and the color left his face so fast I thought he might need to sit down. He did sit down, in my chair, at my table, in my house. But he didn't know that yet. Not really. Not the way he was about to. Here's the part that's hard to admit. For 3 years, I let this family believe I was the help. I refilled water glasses at dinners I paid for. I scrubbed grout in a bathroom my signature built. I smiled at a woman who called me sweetheart in the tone people usually say for waitstaff. And I let her, because I was patient, and because I was waiting for exactly this moment. The moment the paperwork would speak louder than she ever had. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the one expected to serve, to smile, to disappear into the background of your own life, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense until you understand who I actually am and what I actually do for a living. I'm a residential real estate closing attorney, not a flashy job. Not the kind you bring up at parties unless someone's buying a condo. But it means I spend my working life reading the fine print other people skip. Title histories, deed restrictions, the difference between a warranty deed and a quitclaim, and why that difference has ended marriages and buried inheritances. I read documents for a living the way other people read faces. And I have one small habit that followed me from law school straight into this whole mess. I drink my coffee black in a chipped navy mug with a hairline cracked down one side, and I refuse to replace it because a professor once told me a good lawyer never trusts anything that looks too perfect. I have carried that mug to 3 different offices. It sat on my desk the night I found the document that changed everything. It's sitting next to me right now. I met my husband, Derek Whitfield, 9 years ago, at a title company holiday party he wasn't even supposed to be at. He was there with a college roommate who worked in mortgage lending. Derek was easy, warm, a little disorganized, the kind of guy who forgets where he put his keys but never forgets your coffee order. I liked that he needed me a little. I didn't know yet that his whole family needed people a little, in a way that eventually curdled into needing people a lot, permanently, without ever saying thank you. Derek's parents, Roy and Marlene Whitfield, had one operating philosophy that I heard for the first time at our engagement dinner and would hear roughly 400 more times over the following decade. Family takes care of family. Marlene said it while refilling everyone's wine except mine because I was driving. Roy said it while asking Derek, in front of the whole table, whether I'd be willing to help out with his brother's tuition since I was the one with the good job. I smiled. I said, sure. We'd look at the numbers. I did not yet understand that family takes care of family in the Whitfield household only ever flowed in one direction, toward them. I want you to remember that phrase. Family takes care of family. Write it down if you need to. It's going to come back. By the time Derek and I got married, I was 3 years into my career and already handling closings solo, the youngest attorney at my firm to be trusted with commercial residential mixed properties, which sounds like a small distinction until you understand how many ways a mixed-use deal can quietly go wrong if nobody in the room actually understands zoning overlays. I say this not to brag, but because it matters for what comes later. I was, by any objective measure, good at protecting people's ownership of the things they'd worked for. It is, professionally, the entire shape of my competence. And somehow, in my own marriage, that exact skill set was treated by my in-laws as decorative. A nice fact about me, mentioned at parties, never once connected to the reality that I might apply it to my own life if pushed far enough. I think that disconnect is common in families like Derek's, honestly. Roy and Marlene had built their whole identity around the idea that they were the stable center of the family, the ones who'd raised good kids and deserved, in their retirement years, to be taken care of in return. It's not an unusual belief. It's just a belief that curdles fast when the person doing the taking care of stops being invisible and starts being useful in ways that are harder to control. I wasn't Derek's sister, who lived near enough to be managed. I wasn't Cole, who needed enough rescuing to stay grateful. I was the daughter-in-law who paid for things quietly and asked for very little in return, and for 3 years, that made me the most convenient person in the household to lean on, precisely because I never seemed to push back. I didn't push back for a long time because pushing back, in my own family growing up, had never gone well. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, and the version of helping out I learned early was the kind that doesn't ask questions, doesn't keep score, doesn't expect thanks. I brought that instinct into my marriage without examining it, and Roy and Marlene, whether they meant to or not, found the exact shape of it within the first year and settled into it like a groove worn into a stair tread. I should tell you a little more about how this family actually worked, because the mechanics matter. Roy and Marlene didn't think of themselves as taking anything from anyone. In their telling, they had raised 3 children on a roofer's modest income, sacrificed for decades, and were now simply collecting on a debt they believed the whole family owed them collectively. Distributed, however, seemed most convenient at any given moment. Derek was the responsible one, which meant he was expected to fix things quietly and without complaint. Patrice was the devoted one, which meant her physical proximity to her parents was treated as though it cost her something, even though, as far as I could ever tell, it mostly cost her Sunday afternoons. Cole was the one who needed rescuing, which meant every dollar that flowed toward him was framed as compassion rather than pattern. And I was the one who'd married in, which meant, in Marlene's arithmetic, that my resources were simply family resources now, mine to offer, and never truly mine to withhold. Derek has a younger brother, Cole, and an older sister, Patrice, both of whom Marlene and Roy discussed with a kind of reverence usually reserved for minor royalty. Cole was creative, which meant he'd started 4 businesses and finished none of them. Patrice was devoted, which meant she lived 11 minutes from her parents and called that a sacrifice. I was, in the family's internal ranking system, useful. Not beloved, useful. There's a difference, and it took me years to stop pretending there wasn't. The first real crack showed up 2 years into our marriage, when Roy's roofing business, the one he'd run for 30 years, started losing contracts to bigger companies with better bids. Roy didn't tell Derek this directly. He told it to me over a Sunday dinner, framed as a casual update. The way people share bad news they've already decided isn't really bad news because someone else is going to fix it. "Business is a little slow," he said. "Passing me the mashed potatoes like this was a normal thing to say to your daughter-in-law. But family takes care of family, right?" I said, "Right. Because what else do you say to your father-in-law over mashed potatoes?" 3 weeks later, Derek came home and told me his parents were between houses. Their landlord had sold the rental they'd been in for 6 years, and the market had priced them out of anything comparable. He asked if they could stay with us for a couple months. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was newly a partner track associate at my firm, making real money for the first time in my life, and I believed, genuinely believed, that helping family when you're able to help is simply what decent people do. I did not yet understand the difference between helping and being absorbed. 2 months turned into 8. 8 turned into just until Roy gets back on his feet. Roy never got back on his feet, not because he couldn't. I'd come to learn, but because feet you don't stand on don't need to hold you up. During those 8 months, I noticed small things. Marlene rearranging my kitchen cabinets to make more sense. Roy parking his truck in my spot in the driveway every single day without asking. Small things. The kind of small things you let go because naming them feels petty and because you've been raised, like most of us have, to believe that being the bigger person means being the quiet one. Here's what I did instead of naming them. I started a folder. I want to be honest with you about what that folder was, because I think it matters. It wasn't a plan for revenge. Not at first. It was a habit born from my job. I document things. Dates. Receipts. Conversations. It's how I was trained to think, and somewhere around month 3 of my in-laws living in my house, I started applying that training to my own life, almost without deciding to. I saved the lease termination notice that had put them out of their rental. I saved a screenshot of a text from Marlene asking me to cover the gas bill this month, just till Roy's check clears. A check that, I'd later learn, never existed, because Roy hadn't had steady income in over a year. I saved the receipt when I quietly paid off $600 of Cole's overdraft fees because Marlene said it would break her heart to see her boys struggle. A heartbreak she apparently reserved only for Cole, since she never once asked whether I was struggling to carry 3 extra adults on my grocery bill. Roy and Marlene eventually left that first time into a small rental Roy's brother helped finance. And for 18 months, things were almost normal. Almost. Marlene still called every Sunday to remind me that family takes care of family, usually right before asking for something. But we had our space back. Derek and I started talking, seriously, about buying a house of our own. Something bigger, something permanent, in the school district we wanted for the kids we were planning. This is the part where I need you to pay close attention, because everything that happened later hinges on a decision I made in a conference room, alone, that nobody in my husband's family knew about for 3 more years. My grandmother, on my mother's side, passed away that spring. She'd been a widow for 20 years, frugal in a way that looked like poverty and was actually discipline, and she left me, not my siblings, me specifically, in a letter she'd had notarized, the bulk of her estate. $410,000. She wrote in that letter that she'd watched me work myself thin, trying to hold other people up, and she wanted this money to be a floor under your feet that nobody can pull away. I still have that letter. I keep it in the same drawer as the Navy binder. I'll get to the binder. I did not tell Derek's parents about the inheritance. I told Derek, of course. We didn't keep secrets from each other, not real ones, but we agreed, together, that this needed to stay between us. Derek, to his credit, understood exactly why. He'd grown up watching his parents treat every dollar that entered the family as a shared resource the moment they became aware of it. If Roy and Marlene knew I had $400,000 sitting in an account, we both knew, within a year, it would not be sitting there anymore. So when we bought our house, a 4-bedroom colonial on Aldermore Lane, the one with the wraparound porch Derek had wanted since we first looked at listings, I made a decision that felt, at the time, like ordinary financial prudence, and would later feel like the smartest thing I ever did without knowing why. I put the house in a trust. Specifically, I used my inheritance as the primary down payment, structured the mortgage so that my name carried the greater share of financial responsibility, and then, on the advice of an estate attorney I worked with regularly, transferred the property into a revocable living trust titled the Castellano Family Trust, with myself as trustee and primary beneficiary, and Derek named as a secondary beneficiary with rights of survivorship. It's a common structure. Asset protection, estate planning, nothing exotic. Derek was fully aware, fully supportive, and fully on the deed as a beneficiary. He would never lose access to our home. But the trust and the title itself sat under my name and my legal control. Derek used to joke that I'd made myself landlord of my own marriage. I used to laugh and tell him I'd just made sure nobody could ever take our home out from under us. I did not know, that day, how literally that sentence would come true. We moved in. We were happy. And then, 11 months later, Roy's rental fell through again. This time because Roy's brother, tired of subsidizing him, stopped paying the difference on the lease. Marlene called me directly this time, not Derek. She used the words she always used, the ones I want you to remember. Family takes care of family, Vivian. We just need somewhere to land. I said yes again. I want to be clear that I'm not proud of how easily I said yes, but I also don't think saying yes was the mistake. The mistake, if you can call it that, was believing that generosity would ever be recognized as generosity in a household that treated it as an entitlement. They moved into our guest suite, downstairs, with its own bathroom, in March. By June, something had shifted that I couldn't name at first. Marlene stopped asking me to help with dinner and started simply expecting it, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed while I cooked, offering commentary. "You always overseason things, sweetheart." Roy started leaving his boots by the front door. My front door, expecting them gone by the time he got home, the way he apparently expected of the receptionist at his old roofing office. Cole, now living 40 minutes away but treating our house as a hotel, started showing up on weekends with laundry. And here is the sentence that finally made me start paying real attention. 6 weeks after they moved in, I came home from a 14-hour closing. 3 properties, 2 of them contentious, the kind of day that leaves you hollowed out, to find Marlene had invited 8 members of her book club over for dinner, in my dining room, Without asking me, she handed me an apron at the door. "Perfect timing," she said. "We need someone to plate the appetizers before you sit down and relax." I plated the appetizers. I want you to sit with that for a second. The way I had to sit with it that night, alone in my own kitchen at 9:40 p.m., washing, serving dishes while 8 women I'd never met discussed, a book I hadn't read, in a house I owned outright, that I had paid for with money my grandmother left me specifically, so nobody could ever make me feel small in my own life again. That was the night I opened a new folder. Not the old one, a new one with a new purpose. I labeled it simply documentation. And from that night forward, I stopped letting things go. I want to give you a few more of these moments because I think it's important you understand this wasn't one dramatic betrayal. It was 100 small ones, each individually forgivable, each collectively unbearable. 2 weeks after the book club dinner, Marlene asked me to just quickly iron 4 of Roy's dress shirts before a job interview he had lined up. An interview I later confirmed through the company's own website that had actually taken place 11 days earlier and that he hadn't gotten. I ironed the shirts anyway, because I didn't know that yet. I didn't know it until I found the rejection email forwarded to Marlene's inbox, sitting 3 folders deep in a shared drive I only had access to because I'd set up our household budgeting software myself. A month after that, at a neighborhood barbecue Derek and I hosted, Marlene introduced me to our new neighbors. People I hadn't met yet, people who would go on to become genuine friends. As Derek's wife, she helps us out around the house. Not an attorney, not a partner at my firm, helps us out around the house. I remember standing there, holding a spatula, smiling, while a woman named Colleen from 3 doors down looked at me with an expression somewhere between confusion and pity, because Colleen, unlike Marlene, had actually asked me what I did for a living the week before at the mailbox and had seemed genuinely impressed by the answer. Then there was the Thanksgiving where Marlene assigned seating, at my table, in my dining room, and placed me at the end nearest the kitchen, so it's easier for you to grab things, while Cole, who had contributed nothing to the meal beyond a store-bought pie, sat at the head beside his father. I didn't say anything that day either. I took a photo of the place cards, though, with my phone, at 4:52 in the afternoon, and saved it to the folder. I didn't know yet what I'd eventually use it for. I just knew, by then, that everything went in the folder. None of these moments, on their own, would convince anyone of anything. That's exactly why they mattered to me. A pattern isn't built from one dramatic sentence. It's built from 100 small ones, stacked in order, with dates attached. Stay with me here, because this next part is where the pattern really starts revealing itself, and I promise you it gets worse before it gets better. Subscribe now if you haven't, because what happens over the next 18 months is the part people in the comments always tell me they had to rewatch twice. Over the following year, the pattern calcified into something close to a routine. Marlene took over meal planning for the household, my household, and then began asking me, every Friday, to chip in for groceries she'd already bought without consulting me. Groceries that increasingly included things for Cole's apartment, since apparently it's easier to just buy in bulk for family. Roy, whose roofing business had quietly folded entirely. A fact he never disclosed to Derek or me directly, though I found the LLC dissolution filing myself, 8 months after it happened, doing a routine county records search for an unrelated case. Began treating our home like a base of semi-permanent residence. No end date discussed, no rent offered, no chores contributed beyond the occasional. Lecture about how I loaded the dishwasher. I did the math, eventually, the way I do math for a living. Over 14 months, I calculated that my in-laws' presence in our home had cost us, in groceries, utilities, Cole's overdraft loans that were never repaid, and one memorable $4,000 dental emergency for Marlene that I'd covered because Roy said insurance had lapsed, an amount just north of $19,000. $19,000, on top of housing, on top of the invisible tax of being treated, in my own home, like domestic staff with a law degree. Derek, I should say clearly, was not blind to all of this. He saw pieces of it. He'd wince when his mother handed me an apron, apologize quietly in bed at night, promise he'd talk to them. He did talk to them, a handful of times, gentle conversations that Marlene absorbed with a hurt expression and the phrase, again, family takes care of family, Derek. I don't understand why that's suddenly a problem. Derek loved his parents in the uncomplicated way people love parents who raise them adequately and never examine the cost of that adequacy. He wanted peace more than he wanted confrontation. I understood that. I even respected it for a while. But understanding a thing and being asked to personally absorb the cost of it indefinitely are two very different positions to hold, and I was tired of holding the second one alone. The inciting moment, the one that finally moved me from quietly documenting to quietly preparing, happened on a Tuesday in October, 14 months before the cold open I gave you at the start of this story. I want to walk you through it slowly, because every detail matters. I'd left my laptop open on the kitchen island that morning, logged into my personal email, while I ran upstairs to grab a file I'd forgotten. When I came back down 4 minutes later, Marlene was standing at the island, not on her phone, not doing anything casual. She was reading my screen. Specifically, she was reading an email from my estate attorney, Diane Ferris, with the subject line, Trust Amendment. Aldermore Lane confirmation. She didn't even pretend she hadn't been reading it. She looked up at me and said, plainly, "Is this house not actually in Derek's name?" I could have lied. I want to be honest that lying would have been easier. In that exact moment, standing in my kitchen with my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. Instead, I told her the truth because I've never been a good liar and because some small part of me, the part that had been quietly filing documents for a year, wanted her to know. I told her the house was held in a trust, that I was trustee, that Derek was a named beneficiary with full rights, that this was standard estate planning, nothing unusual, nothing that changed anything about our marriage or our lives together. Marlene's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went very still and very calculating, in a way that had nothing to do with hurt and everything to do with recalculation. She said, "Huh," and went back to her coffee. That single syllable, sat with me for weeks afterward because I knew, the way you know weather is about to turn even before the sky changes color, that something had shifted in how this family was thinking about me. 3 weeks later, at a Sunday dinner, Roy raised, out of nowhere, the topic of the family's long-term housing situation. He talked about how it would make sense, honestly, for the house to eventually be a family asset. His words, since we're all under one roof anyway, and who knows what the future holds. Derek laughed it off, thought his father was joking. I did not think Roy was joking. I'd read enough contested title cases in my career to recognize the particular shape of a person testing the water before making a real move. 2 months after that dinner, I discovered, through nothing more dramatic than an alert from my county's title notification service, which I'd set up years earlier as a professional habit, monitoring for any filings attached to properties I had interest in, that a document search had been run on the Aldermore Lane property's ownership history by a private title research firm. Not by me, not by Derek. By someone else entirely, someone who'd paid a fee to pull a full title report on a house they didn't own. I want to be very clear with you about what that meant, because it's the kind of detail that separates a paranoid guess from documented fact. Somebody, using resources they'd have needed to pay for, had gone looking for a way into the ownership structure of my home. I didn't yet know who, but I had a very strong guess. This is the part that's hard to admit. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even tell Derek right away, not fully. I told him someone had pulled records on the house, and he assumed, reasonably, it might be related to refinancing rates or a neighbor's curiosity. I let him believe that, because I needed time to understand what I was actually looking at before I turned it into a family conflict. Instead, I called Diane, my estate attorney, and asked her a single question. If someone attempted to file a fraudulent deed transfer or forge a quitclaim on a property held in an active trust, what would that look like on paper, and how quickly would it be caught? Diane's answer became the blueprint for everything I did over the following year. She told me that Massachusetts, like most states, requires notarization for any deed transfer to be recorded, and that most fraud attempts fail not because the fraud itself is hard, but because forgers underestimate how tightly title companies, notaries, and county recorders cross-check identity and chain of title before anything gets logged into the system. She told me the single most common fraud vector in family disputes like this one wasn't a dramatic forged signature. It was a vulnerable, aging homeowner being pressured into signing something they didn't fully understand. Since I wasn't vulnerable and hadn't signed anything, the real risk wasn't to me. It was that someone might attempt to forge my signature, or Derek's, on a document neither of us had agreed to. That conversation is when I stopped simply documenting the past and started actively watching the present. I set up something Diane calls a title alert lock, an extra layer some title insurance companies and county recorders' offices offer, where any attempt to file or amend a deed on a specified property triggers an immediate notification to the property owner before anything can be recorded. Most people don't know this service exists. I knew, because I'd recommended it to clients for a decade. I'd simply never thought I'd need it in my own kitchen. I also did something Diane specifically advised against doing without a clear purpose, and I did it anyway, because by that point, purpose had found me. I began quietly saving every conversation, every text, every voicemail from Marlene, Roy, and Cole that touched on money, housing, or the family's future. Screenshots, dated, organized by category, all consolidated into a single navy blue 3-ring binder I kept in the locked bottom drawer of my home office desk. I labeled it, on the spine, simply, House. 22 months of behavior went into that binder before it was ever opened in front of anyone else. Every chip in for groceries, text where Marlene had already spent the money without asking. Every voicemail from Roy explaining, again, why he just needed a little more time to find steady work. The dental bill receipt, the overdraft payment to Cole's bank, the title search notification. Screenshots of 3 separate conversations over 8 months where Marlene referenced, when the house is properly in the family's name, as though it were an inevitability rather than a fantasy she was actively trying to engineer. And then, 4 months before the night I described at the start of this story, I found the document that turned a slow simmering suspicion into absolute certainty. I was doing something mundane, backing up shared files from a household laptop Derek and I used for bill pay and budgeting, a laptop Marlene had also started using, with our permission, to help manage the family calendar. While transferring files, I noticed a folder I didn't recognize, nested 3 levels deep, named simply R and M Docs. Inside, it was a single PDF, a template quitclaim deed, partially filled out, with our address on Aldermore Lane already typed into the property description field, and 2 signature lines at the bottom. One labeled Vivian Castellano Whitfield, a name I have never once used, since I kept my maiden name professionally and never hyphenated anything, and one labeled Derek Whitfield. Both lines were blank. But both lines had small, faint pencil tracings beneath them, practice signatures, the kind you do when you're teaching yourself to replicate someone else's handwriting. I sat with that document open on my screen for 11 minutes before I moved. I know it was 11 minutes because I looked at the clock when I found it, and again when I finally closed the laptop. By the time I closed that laptop, 11 minutes after opening the folder, I had already started, almost involuntarily, sorting what I'd found into the same numbered structure I use for exhibits in a closing packet. It's a habit. I couldn't turn it off, even in shock. Exhibit 1, the quitclaim template itself, dated by its metadata to 11 weeks earlier, with our address already populated in the property description field. Exhibit 2, the pencil tracings beneath both signature lines, faint but visible when I increased the document's zoom to 400%, showing at least 6 distinct attempts at replicating a signature that wasn't Roy's or Marlene's own. Exhibit 3, a second, earlier draft of the same document, saved 4 days before the version I'd found, using a slightly different legal description of the property. One that, I'd realize later, matched an outdated version of our parcel record from before a boundary survey we'd had done the year we bought the house, suggesting Roy had pulled the description from a public assessor's site rather than our actual deed. Exhibit 4, a folder of saved links, browser history essentially printed onto the desktop, to 3 different How to Transfer a House Between Family Members articles, one of which specifically addressed how quitclaim deeds require less scrutiny than warranty deeds and are commonly used, the article noted, for exactly this kind of intra-family transfer. 4 exhibits, 1 folder, 11 minutes. I did not confront anyone that night either. I want you to understand why, because I think it's the single most important decision in this entire story. If I had confronted Roy and Marlene in that moment, emotionally, in the heat of discovery, they would have had time to delete the file, destroy the printed drafts, deny everything, and reframe my accusation as paranoid hostility toward 2 people who'd given up everything to be near their son. I would have had a feeling. I would not have had proof. And feelings, in a family that has spent years insisting you're the difficult one for noticing patterns, do not win arguments. Proof does. So instead, I did what I do for a living. I built a file. I saved the PDF with its metadata intact. The metadata that showed it had been created 11 weeks earlier on Roy's tablet and edited 4 separate times since. I had Diane review it and confirm, in writing, that the document constituted an unrecorded fraudulent instrument, that any attempt to notarize and file it would be a felony under state law, and that we had grounds, right now, to pursue both a restraining order against further attempts and a criminal referral if it escalated. I contacted the title insurance company that held our policy and formally activated the title alert lock, which Diane had recommended 11 months earlier and which I had, until this point, treated as a precaution rather than a necessity. I contacted a notary public licensing board contact Diane knew personally and asked, hypothetically, what would happen to a notary who knowingly notarized a forged signature? The answer was immediate license revocation and potential criminal liability, which told me that whoever eventually tried to notarize this document, if they succeeded in forging our signatures well enough to fool a notary, would need either a very convincing forgery or a notary willing to look the other way. I began, quietly, keeping track of which notaries Marlene had mentioned by name over the preceding months. There was one. A woman named Sherry Voss, who ran a small notary and tax prep office 2 towns over, who Marlene had described, months earlier, as an old friend from church who owes me a favor. I found Sherry Voss's business license was active, but had one prior complaint on file with the state, 3 years earlier, for notarizing a document without the signer present. A complaint that had resulted in a formal warning rather than revocation. A warning, not a clean record. A person who had already, once, been willing to bend the rule that exists specifically to prevent what my in-laws were now attempting. I told Derek everything, in full, on a Sunday afternoon while his parents were at church, 3 months before the confrontation. I laid the binder out on our dining table, the same table Marlene had made me plate appetizers beside, and I walked him through every document, in order, the way I'd walk a client through a closing they didn't fully understand yet. I watched my husband's face change, piece by piece, from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet devastation I'd never seen on him before. He didn't yell. He's not a yeller. He put his hand flat on the table over the printed quitclaim template and said, very quietly, they were going to forge my signature, not our signature. His. Because somewhere in that moment, I think Derek understood, for the first time, that his parents didn't see this as taking something from a daughter-in-law they'd never fully respected. They saw it as reclaiming something from a son they believed still, deep down, belonged to them more than he belonged to himself. There's one more scene from that period I want to tell you, because I think it explains something about how deep the assumption ran. A week after I showed Derek the binder, before we decided on any plan at all, Marlene asked me, over breakfast, whether I could front Cole another $1,100 for a security deposit on a new apartment, since his credit was still recovering from the overdrafts I'd already quietly covered twice before. She asked this 3 days after I'd found the practice signatures. 3 days. She had no idea I knew anything, and she was, in that exact window, still treating me as an ATM with a pulse. I told her, calmly, that I needed to think about it. I never gave Cole the money. It was the first time in 3 years I'd said no to a direct financial request from that family, and the sky did not fall, and Marlene brought it up twice more that week in a tone that suggested she found my refusal almost baffling, like I'd broken an unwritten law she'd assumed I understood as clearly as she did. Derek asked me one question that afternoon that I think about often. He asked, "Why didn't you just confront them the day you found the search request?" And I told him what I'm telling you now, because a confrontation without proof is just a fight. And I was done having fights I could lose on the strength of my composure alone. I wanted to win with paper. We agreed, together, on a plan. We would not tip our hand. We would not change our behavior toward Roy and Marlene in any visible way. We would let the timeline play out, because Diane's read on the situation, confirmed by the pencil tracing practice signatures and the multiple document revisions, was that they were building toward an actual attempt, not just a fantasy. And people who are building toward something, given enough rope, will eventually show you exactly when and how they intend to use it. We didn't have to wait long. 6 weeks later, Marlene mentioned, almost offhand, over dinner, that Roy's cousin, a retired county clerk named Phyllis, had told them there's a simpler way to handle title stuff than people think if everyone's basically already family anyway. I logged the date. I logged the exact phrasing. It went in the binder. Then, 5 weeks after that, came the ticking clock. Marlene announced at what she called a family meeting, held, again, at my own dining table without my input on the agenda, that she and Roy wanted to finalize some paperwork the following Saturday at 10 in the morning before a small family lunch she was planning. She said it lightly, the way you'd announce a dentist appointment. Just a formality, she said, echoing, almost word for word, the phrase I opened this story with. You'll sign some papers for Uncle Roy. Nothing complicated. She'd started calling him Uncle Roy to me recently, a strange little linguistic push toward folding me fully into the Whitfield structure, as though enough repetition of a family word might make the underlying claim more true. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said it. At the counter, rinsing a coffee mug that wasn't my navy one, because that one was already in the dishwasher from earlier that morning. I remember setting the mug down slowly, deliberately, so my hands wouldn't betray anything. Derek, beside me, laughed a little, the way you laugh at something that sounds harmless, and said, "Sure, Mom, whatever you need." He had no idea, in that moment, what he'd just agreed to. Neither, really, did I, not the specifics. But I knew the shape of it the second Marlene said papers, because I'd been waiting 11 weeks since the day I found that folder on the shared laptop for someone to finally tell me when. Now I had a when. Saturday, 10 in the morning. A date and an hour, sitting in my calendar next to a dentist appointment I actually did have, and a closing I'd need to reschedule because nothing about that Saturday morning was going to be quick. I had 6 days between that announcement and the Saturday in question. I used every one of them. And I want to walk you through those 6 days specifically, because a ticking clock only means something if you understand what was happening inside it. Day 1, Monday, I called Diane first thing before my own morning meetings and read her the exact wording of Marlene's announcement. Diane's read was immediate and clinical. A specific date, a specific hour, a stated document, and a notary already informally lined up meant this had moved from planning into execution, and execution windows are exactly when people make mistakes that create paper trails. Day 2, Tuesday. Diane's office filed the preemptive title alert lock formally, in writing, with the county recorder, rather than relying on the informal monitoring service I'd set up on my own months earlier. This mattered, she explained, because a formally filed lock creates its own time-stamped record independent of anything I could be accused of fabricating later. Day 3, Wednesday. The subpoena for the title search firm's billing records came back, definitively tying the earlier ownership history request to a card ending in the same 4 digits as Roy's primary checking account, a piece of paper that turned my strong guess into something a district attorney's office could use. Day 4, Thursday. Diane's office placed the call to Sherry Voss's regulatory contact, framed carefully as a routine compliance reminder rather than a warning, so that nothing could later be characterized as witness tampering or improper interference. I remember asking Diane if this felt like overkill. She told me overkill is what happens when you win before anyone has to raise their voice. Day 5, Friday. I told Derek everything about the plan for Saturday morning, in full, including Grant's involvement, because I wasn't willing to let my husband walk into his own dining room blind to what I'd built around him. He asked me if I was scared. I told him I wasn't scared. I was prepared, which is a different feeling entirely, and one I wished, honestly, I'd let myself feel 3 years earlier. Day 6, Saturday, 10 in the morning, exactly as Marlene had announced. I confirmed, through Diane, that we had enough documented evidence. The metadata-verified draft quitclaim, the multiple screenshots referencing when the house is in the family's name, the title search request paid for by a card traced back to Roy's name through a public records subpoena Diane filed preemptively, to support both a civil cease and desist and if they proceeded with an actual filing. Attempt, a criminal fraud referral to the county district attorney's office. I confirmed with the title insurance company that the alert lock was fully active and would flag any attempted recording within minutes, routing directly to Diane's office and mine. I quietly reached out to Sherry Voss's regulatory board contact and confirmed that if Sherry knowingly notarized a document with signers who weren't both physically present and properly identified, her license would be immediately suspended pending investigation, and I made sure. Through a call from Diane's office, not mine, so nothing could be traced back to tipping our hand. That Sherry Voss received a professional, procedurally neutral reminder about identity verification requirements roughly 1 week before the planned Saturday signing. I want to be honest that this was a calculated move. I wasn't going to let Sherry Voss walk into that morning unaware of exactly how carefully her actions would be scrutinized, and I hired an investigator. Not a dramatic one. A licensed paralegal investigator named Grant Oyalaran, who Diane's firm used regularly for exactly this kind of situation. Someone whose entire job was to be quietly, unremarkably present at moments when a paper trail needed a witness. Grant had spent 11 years doing exactly this kind of work, sitting in rooms during contentious estate disputes, custody handoffs, business dissolutions, anywhere a neutral, credible third party might later need to testify to what had actually been said, in what tone, by whom. He told me, on our one phone call before that Saturday, that the single most important thing he could offer wasn't intimidation. It was memory. A jury, or a judge, or in this case, simply a family, trusts a stranger's plain account of a room far more than they trust the account of anyone with something to gain from how that room is remembered. I asked Grant to attend the Saturday family lunch as my guest, introduced simply as a colleague from work, present the entire time, taking mental and eventually written notes on everything said and done. I should tell you a little about Sherry Voss, too, because she matters more than a passing character in this story. Sherry had known Marlene for almost 2 decades, since their daughters. Sherry had a daughter Patrice's age, had been in the same church youth group. She ran her tax and notary practice out of a converted garage 2 towns over, the kind of small operation that survives on regulars and referrals rather than advertising. The prior complaint on her record, the one about notarizing a document without the signer present, had involved an elderly parishioner and a power of attorney form, and Sherry had told the board, at the time, that she'd simply trusted a family member's assurance that everything was in order. It hadn't been. She'd received a warning instead of losing her commission entirely, largely because the board believed her account of an honest, if careless, mistake. I don't think Sherry set out to help commit fraud against me. I think Sherry was, once again, someone who trusted a family member's assurance a little too easily. The difference this time was that I made sure, well before Saturday, that trusting blindly wasn't going to be the easy option anymore. I want to walk you through this morning slowly because every beat of it mattered, and because I think it's the part of this story people replay the most. Marlene had the dining table set with a lace runner I'd never seen before, coffee cups arranged with a formality usually reserved for holidays. Roy sat at the head of the table, my table, in my house, with a manila folder in front of him. Cole was there too, which surprised me slightly, until I understood, watching him, that he'd been brought along as a witness on their side, someone to affirm, later, that everything had happened calmly and by mutual agreement. Sherry Voss arrived at 9:52, 8 minutes early, carrying her notary stamp and logbook in a small zippered case, greeting Marlene with the easy familiarity of someone who'd done this exact kind of favor before. Grant arrived at 9:58, introduced by me, simply, as my colleague Grant. He's in town for a work thing. Hope you don't mind him joining. Marlene said, of course not. Family is family. The more the merrier. A phrase that would sound almost unbearably ironic in about 11 minutes. At 10:04, Roy opened the manila folder and slid a document across the table toward Derek and me. It was almost exactly the quitclaim template I'd found on the shared laptop 11 weeks after its creation, 4 months after Roy had first started editing it, now filled in completely. Our names, both spelled correctly this time, the property description accurate down to the parcel number, and 2 signature lines waiting, blank, for us. Roy said, "This is over. You're going to sign some papers for Uncle Roy. Just a formality." He smiled when he said it. He genuinely believed, I think, that the months of small pressure, the family takes care of family refrain, the slow normalization of shared ownership language, the presence of Sherry Voss's notary stamp sitting right there on the table like an inevitability, had done the work of making this feel unrefusable. I smiled back. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the document, read it carefully, the way I read every document, out loud in part, for Grant's benefit, and for the recording I'd disclosed to no one, but that Massachusetts one-party consent law made entirely legal for me to make on my own property, in my own home, of a conversation I was a direct participant in. I said, "This is a quitclaim deed transferring the Aldermore Lane property from the Castellano Family Trust into joint ownership with Roy and Marlene Whitfield." I said it plainly, almost gently, the way you'd read a diagnosis back to a patient to confirm they understood it. Roy nodded, pleased, mistaking my calm for compliance. Then I asked Sherry Voss directly, in front of everyone, whether she had confirmed the identity of both signers and whether both signers were required to be present, in person, for her to notarize their signatures. Sherry's face changed instantly. The professional reminder Diane's office had sent her the week before had clearly landed, because she said, carefully, that yes, both signers would need to be present with valid ID, and that she'd need to verify the signatures matched exactly. I said, "I've never signed my name as Castellano Whitfield. I don't hyphenate. And I'm not signing this document today, or any day, because this house isn't held in a way that can be transferred by quitclaim without my consent as trustee, which I'm not giving." The room went very quiet. Roy said, too fast, "Vivian, don't make this difficult. We've all discussed this." I said, "We haven't discussed anything. You discussed it. With yourselves. And with a template you started drafting 11 weeks before today, with a signature you practiced forging in pencil, on a laptop you weren't supposed to be using for anything but the family calendar." I slid my own folder across the table. Not the whole binder. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone in front of Cole. Not fully. Not yet. Just the essentials. A printed copy of the metadata report showing the document's creation date and 4 revision timestamps. A printed screenshot of the title search request traced to a card in Roy's name. A single page from Diane's letter, on firm letterhead, stating plainly that the document in front of them constituted an attempted fraudulent conveyance, and that any further attempt to notarize or file it would result in an immediate criminal referral to the County District Attorney's Office for deed fraud, alongside a formal complaint to the State Notary Licensing Board naming Sherry Voss specifically. Sherry Voss stood up from the table so fast her chair nearly tipped. She said she wanted no part of this, gathered her stamp and logbook, and left within 90 seconds, without so much as finishing her coffee. That was the moment I watched Roy's plan actually die. Not in my words, but in the sound of Sherry's car door closing in my driveway. Cole looked down at the table. Roy's hands, I noticed, had gone very still on top of the manila folder, the way hands go still when a person is trying very hard not to look like they're panicking. The lace runner Marlene had ironed that morning sat between us, absurdly formal, a tablecloth for an occasion that had just collapsed into something much smaller and much more exposed than anyone at that table had planned for. Marlene tried one more time, her voice sliding into the register she always used when the family motto wasn't landing the way she wanted. "Family takes care of family, Vivian. I don't understand why you're doing this to us," I said, level, quiet. The way I'd say it to a client asking an unreasonable question at closing. Family doesn't forge signatures. Family doesn't practice forging signatures in pencil for 11 weeks. What you're describing isn't family taking care of family. It's family taking the family home. Roy's face had gone from confident to gray. He looked at Derek, waiting for his son to intervene the way sons had always been expected to intervene on his behalf. Derek didn't raise his voice either. I think, watching him in that moment, I finally understood how much of my composure he'd absorbed over the years, almost by osmosis. He said, "Dad, you tried to forge my signature." My signature? Not just Vivian's. And Roy had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. I told them, calmly, that I wasn't calling the police that day, and that whether this ever became a criminal matter depended entirely on what happened next. I told them Diane's letter stood as a formal notice that any future attempt to file any instrument against the Aldermore Lane property by anyone would be caught within minutes by the title alert lock already active with the county recorder's office, and that I had already, as of that morning, filed a preemptive fraud alert with the recorder directly naming Roy and Marlene Whitfield as parties who had attempted an unauthorized transfer. Cole, who'd said nothing the entire time, sitting there as the witness his parents had wanted, finally spoke, quietly, to his father. "You had me sit here for this? He looked genuinely rattled, and I believed him, because whatever else Cole was, he hadn't been part of the drafting. He'd simply been brought along, like Sherry, like Grant, as set dressing for a plan he apparently hadn't fully understood the mechanics of. Stay with me, because what happened over the following weeks is where all of this either falls apart or holds together, and I want you to see exactly how it held. I remember, in the hour after everyone finally left that morning, Sherry first, then Cole helping his visibly shaken father to the car, then Marlene last, standing in my doorway for a long moment before she finally turned and walked to the passenger seat. Sitting back down at that same dining table with Derek, both of us quiet, the lace runner still there, the coffee cups still full and cold. Derek reached over and put his hand over mine, on top of the folder I hadn't needed to open all the way. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to really see it." I told him he didn't need to apologize, that seeing your own parents clearly, for the first time, at 36 years old, is one of the harder things a person can be asked to do, and that he'd done it, in the end, exactly when it mattered. Grant's written account of the morning, dated and signed, went into a supplemental file with Diane's office within 24 hours. Diane sent a formal cease and desist to Roy and Marlene by certified mail, outlining the fraud attempt in full legal language, stating clearly that any further action would trigger both civil litigation and a criminal referral. The State Notary Licensing Board opened a preliminary inquiry into Sherry Voss within the week, based on the complaint Diane's office had filed. Not for what she'd done, since she'd ultimately refused to notarize anything, but for the earlier pattern of behavior the board's own prior warning had already flagged. Sherry, I later learned, voluntarily surrendered her commission rather than face a formal hearing, closing her small tax prep and notary business within 2 months. Roy and Marlene did not go quietly, at first. For about 3 weeks, Marlene called Derek daily, alternating between tearful apologies and indignant accusations that I had humiliated them in front of Cole, that I was punishing them for a misunderstanding, that family takes care of family, and I had broken that sacred rule by involving lawyers and investigators over a simple paperwork issue. Derek, to his enormous credit, held the line in a way I don't think even he expected he could. He told his mother, plainly, that attempting to forge his signature on a document transferring his own home wasn't a misunderstanding. He told her that the phrase she kept repeating had, for years, only ever meant one thing in their household, that he and I take care of the family, and the family takes. Roy attempted, once, to contact Diane's office directly, trying to argue that he'd never actually intended to file anything, that the document was just a draft, nothing final. Diane's response, delivered by letter, was simple. Metadata doesn't distinguish between intention and attempt, and 11 weeks of drafting, 4 separate revisions, and a scheduled notarization appointment with a specific notary constituted more than idle daydreaming under the relevant statute. She reminded him, formally, that the county district attorney's office would view the matter the same way if it ever needed to. Roy did not respond to that letter. Within 6 weeks, Roy and Marlene moved out of our home entirely. Not because we forced them out with police or eviction proceedings, which we'd discussed with Diane as an option, but ultimately didn't need, but because the ground beneath their entire strategy had simply disappeared. There was no house to eventually inherit through pressure. There was no vulnerable daughter-in-law who'd sign what she was told to sign. There was, instead, a trust structure, a title alert lock, a paralegal investigator's signed statement, and a Navy binder they'd never even seen the full contents of, sitting in a locked drawer, ready to be produced in full if they ever tried again. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment Roy's brother, once again, helped finance. The same brother who'd grown visibly tired, over a family phone call I wasn't present for, but heard about secondhand from Derek, of being the family's perpetual financial backstop. I understand, from Cole, that conversation didn't go well for Roy either. Cole, in the months that followed, distanced himself somewhat from his parents' version of events. He reached out to me directly, about 2 months after the Saturday confrontation, and said something I didn't expect. He said he'd found out, separately, that his parents had also discussed, at one point, using a similar family takes care of family pressure campaign to get access to a small savings account of his, tied to a settlement from a car accident years earlier, before ultimately deciding it wasn't worth the effort compared to a whole house. Hearing that, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself understand before. I wasn't the exception in this family system. I was simply the largest, most convenient target it had found. Patrice, Derek's sister, stayed largely uninvolved, which told its own quiet story. She sent one text to Derek, weeks later, saying only, "I always figured something like this would happen eventually. Glad you two were smart about it." Smart. As if what we'd done had been a matter of intelligence rather than 3 years of accumulated exhaustion finally organized into paper. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm I hadn't expected. Week 1, certified mail, delivered, signed for by Marlene herself, a detail Diane's office confirmed through the tracking number. Week 2, the notary board's preliminary letter to Sherry Voss, and a phone call from Sherry to Marlene that I only know about because Marlene mentioned it weeks later in a tone that suggested Sherry had not been gentle about her own exposure in all this. Week 3, Roy's brother, tired of a decade of quiet subsidy, told Roy plainly, in a conversation Derek heard secondhand, that he wouldn't be covering another lease if, "This is the kind of thing you two get up to when someone finally gives you a roof." Week 5. The 2-bedroom apartment lease signed, smaller than anything Roy and Marlene had lived in during their entire marriage, in a complex neither of them had ever mentioned wanting to live in. Week 6. The move itself, boxes loaded by coal and a rented truck. No fanfare, no goodbye dinner, no acknowledgement from either Roy or Marlene that anything unusual had happened at all. The same silence, I noticed, that they'd always used whenever a version of events didn't flatter them. Diane did, eventually, submit the full file to the County District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit. Not because we were determined to see Roy prosecuted, but because Diane felt strongly that a formal record needed to exist somewhere beyond our own binder. An assistant district attorney reviewed the file 6 weeks later and sent a letter declining to pursue charges at that time on the basis that no document had actually been filed or notarized, and that the attempt, while clearly documented, had been voluntarily abandoned before completion. The letter did note, in careful legal language, that the file would remain open and could be reactivated if any similar attempt was ever made in the future. I keep a copy of that letter in the binder, too. It's not a conviction. It didn't need to be. It's a permanent, government-issued record that says, plainly, that this happened and that it was taken seriously enough to review. Roy's credit, already strained from the roofing business collapse, took a further hit that same year, unrelated to any of this directly, but compounded by it. The 2-bedroom apartment required a co-signer since his own application couldn't clear underwriting on its own, which is how his brother ended up back in the picture one final time, reluctantly, with conditions attached that Roy had never had to accept from anyone before. By month 3, the story inside the family had already begun to soften at the edges, the way stories do when the people who lived through the sharp part want to remember it more gently. Marlene told her sister, I later heard, that there had simply been some confusion about paperwork. Roy, as far as I know, has never once described what happened using the word fraud or forgery or attempt. He calls it, when he calls it anything, that whole misunderstanding with the house. I've stopped correcting him. The documents don't need my help remembering what actually happened. Here's where I want to be honest with you about something people don't often say out loud in stories like this. I did not want to end the relationship with my in-laws permanently. I know that surprises some of you, given everything I've just described. But I've learned, over the years, that justice and permanent estrangement aren't automatically the same thing, and that reconciliation, when it's offered, has to be offered on terms that protect the person who was harmed, not terms designed to make the person who caused the harm comfortable again as quickly as possible. About 4 months after the confrontation, Marlene reached out, through Derek, asking whether we might all sit down properly and move past this as a family. I agreed to one conversation on 3 conditions, which I stated plainly in writing before agreeing to anything else. First, any future financial help we chose to offer Roy and Marlene would be structured formally, in writing, as either a documented loan with terms or an explicit, one-time gift, never again an ambient, undocumented expectation. Second, Roy and Marlene would never again be permitted unsupervised access to any shared devices, accounts, or documents in our household. Not as punishment, but as a boundary any reasonable person would recognize as necessary after what had happened. Third, and most importantly, the phrase family takes care of family was retired from use in my presence entirely. If either of them wanted a relationship with me going forward, they would need to describe what they actually wanted from me in specific, honest terms, rather than hiding behind a motto that had, for years, functioned as a blank check written on my labor. Marlene cried during that conversation. I believe some of it was genuine. I also believe some of it was the particular grief of losing access to a version of me that no longer existed. The version who plated appetizers without being asked twice, who covered overdrafts without documentation, who mistook being useful for being loved. That version of me isn't coming back, and I told her so, gently but plainly. We do see each other now, occasionally, at holidays, at Derek's insistence, and my own cautious agreement. Roy is quieter than he used to be. Marlene has, to her partial credit, stopped saying the phrase entirely. I haven't heard it once in the 8 months since that conversation. It's a small thing. It's also, in a family like this one, almost everything. The first holiday we spent together afterward was Christmas, 7 months after the confrontation. I set the table myself that year, with my own seating chart, and I put myself at the head, opposite Derek, the way it should have been from the beginning. Marlene noticed. I watched her notice. She didn't say anything about it, and I think that silence, more than any apology she ever offered me, was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I was ever going to get, and I've made peace with that being enough. Roy brought a bottle of wine that day, unprompted, the first gift of any kind he'd given me in 9 years of marriage. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even particularly good wine, if I'm honest. But he handed it to me directly, at the door, and said, "Thank you for having us," instead of announcing himself the way he used to, the way a man announces his own homecoming rather than a guest's arrival. I took the bottle. I said, "Of course." And that was the entire exchange. And it was, in its own small and unglamorous way, the first honest interaction Roy and I had ever had. I don't know if this family will ever fully understand what almost happened on that Saturday morning, or how close they came to losing, not just a relationship with me, but a legal fight neither of them could have afforded, financially or otherwise. I've decided I don't need them to understand it completely. I only need them to remember it well enough to never test it again. Here's what I learned from all of this. And I say this not as a lecture, but as something I wish someone had told me a decade earlier, back when I first heard the words "family takes care of family," and mistook them for warmth instead of the opening line of a negotiation. Boundaries that live only in your head protect nobody. A boundary only becomes real the moment it's written down, dated, and backed by something that doesn't depend on your ability to stay calm in the middle of an argument. I didn't win that Saturday morning because I was right. Being right had never once, in 3 years, been enough to change how that family treated me. I won because being right came with a folder, a metadata report, a licensed investigator, and a title alert lock that made the truth impossible to argue with. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Quiet isn't the same as weak, and patience isn't the same as passive. The most powerful thing I ever did in that marriage wasn't the day I confronted my in-laws at that table. It was every ordinary Tuesday for 3 years before it, when I quietly saved a screenshot instead of starting a fight I wasn't ready to win yet. I also learned something about the phrase itself, the one I asked you to remember at the beginning. Family takes care of family. I don't think that phrase is a lie, exactly. I think it's true. And I think it's supposed to run in every direction at once, not just toward the people who say it loudest or the people who've convinced themselves they're owed it. The year I stopped accepting a one-directional version of that sentence was the year my marriage actually started belonging to me and Derek, rather than to whichever Whitfield needed something that month. I don't regret the 3 years it took me to learn that. I only regret how long I let a single sentence do the work that boundaries should have been doing all along. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the fixer, the useful one, the one who paid for a seat at a table where you were still handed an apron, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Share this with the one person in your life who needs to hear that composure is not surrender. I still keep the navy binder in that same locked drawer, even now, months later, when I no longer need it the way I once did. I don't keep it out of anger. I keep it the same way I keep the chipped navy mug on my desk, as a reminder that the things worth protecting are rarely protected by volume. They're protected by attention, by patience, and by a willingness to write everything down long before anyone else believes you'll ever need to. I'll see you in the next one.